As usual, email me with anything you want to have on or any slides that you want to see. Okay, there was a nice little chunk on Channel 4 News with Chris Boardman. We turned off global traffic. We turned it off for 5 months. It would be a tragedy if the world doesn't capitalize on the huge increase in cycling over the coronavirus period. They do still call him the former Olympic cyclist, but that must really annoy him, actually. I think it does. You know, he's done so much since then. Okay, now, campaigning on low traffic neighborhoods. I strongly suggest you follow tweeters like Danny Williams, City Mobility, and Paul Gannon to keep abreast of developments in London about the various people organising semi-covertly against LTMs. We had this from this guy, Sean Day. I'm the cabbie that spearheaded the campaign against the busgate, etc., etc. Our argument has garnered very little support from local businesses and residents, resulting in us being jumped all over by the cycling lobby. Yoo-hoo. Yeah, they do keep an eye on those kind of people. Sarah Berry, who I think might be with us today, she's got a nice little thread there on 10 things you can do, including saying thank you to the council for when they do good things. Okay, now there have been some important things to read. Research on low traffic neighborhoods. Here's something from Rachel Aldred, as usual, as a link there. The first bit of research on what happens with them going in. Here's a big study on air quality. It's not just brake particles, exhaust emissions, it's now asphalt. With heavier and heavier vehicles, the combined total of particle pollution from road surface, brake and tyre wear is now greater than the particle emissions from vehicle exhaust, but there are no policies to control this. I think that's just in the summer, but important article to read. It's a good Cycling UK blog post by Roger Geffen on the need for targets in the carbon reduction strategy, which you should have all replied to the consultation on. Important to read that. I've got these articles and pieces up, as well as the ones at the end of the presentation, because they are important and you do need to read them. There's a new e-bike study from Oslo saying that new e-bike owners tend to drive less, and a meta-analysis of 76 different studies of e-bikes there, saying the personal use of e-bikes is associated with a reduction in motorized vehicle use with potential positive impacts on environment and health. Lucy Tausig has got an article on how secondary schools seem to be being missed out on and the need to correct that. And there's a nice spreadsheet for you on the recent low traffic neighborhood interventions in the UK. It's here on a Google Spreadsheets document. It's done by a guy on Twitter called Brian Jones. Here's the diversity page. What I'm doing is putting in red things that are new. There's Lucy's article on secondary school kids. The Black Cyclists Network took Wandsworth Cyclist Campaign out on a tour of Tooting to support Black Pound Day. There were so many of us, we took the whole lane, a force to be reckoned with. Rachel reported back from Carolyn Axtell about her impressive work with Joyriders London in getting mostly Muslim and ethnic minority women cycling and supporting some trainers ride leaders in Waltham Forest. And there's a new report out, Diversity in Cycling, which you should take a look at. Okay, here's the delay slide. Now 5 months plus since lockdown, what has happened where you are always very shortly about to? And there's Alex's thing, I said that last week. 80% of the government's announced £225 million for walking and cycling is still just a number. When is the allocation going to happen? We've been told early September. Well, hasn't happened as of today. So delay, 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 delay. On the ground, it all depends where you live. Horsham, this is from Mark Treasure. The Emergency Active Travel Fund pop-up cycle lane. It seems that they've gone for the radical approach of only providing it for a lane in one direction. Now, I mention that because Mark Treasure is obviously going to be on the ball, and there are a number of local campaigners who will keep a close eye on things. But how many bad schemes are going in which go in under the radar? How often are there going to be well-informed people who will report on the detail? So that's something we need to remember. And of course, Family Bicycle report back on Northamptonshire's first and only school street launched with significant media coverage. A bit more on it a bit below here. Right, now in Hull, there was this big article here. A cyclist chooses to ride on the road instead of the new cycle lane. Oh, you know, what a pathetic, sad loser you have to be to notice that. Contact the local paper, and the local paper hasn't got anything else to talk about. You know, this is part of this whole kind of, we're doing you a big favor by telling you to get out of our way, and you won't get out of our way, and it's not fair. You know, all that's still going on. There was some debate and discussion about it. It might have, the whole Daily Mail may be taking a different tack. We hope so in the future. And here's that famous school streets. And I do like that you can't quite see it there. It says, access to quick fit as usual. Yes, we couldn't have that fiddled around with. Anyway, so there's a school street in Northants. This Kelvin Way in Glasgow, I've got that in because these seem to be about the nicest planters I've seen. From what I've seen tweeted, this is nice, but leading to it at either end are not very nice. So I never know exactly what's going on the whole route, and that's the thing that's really going to count. And I mention that because last week I talked about Oldfield Road in Manchester, and there was some nice burned off hatching with in the central part with cycle lanes and wands on part of it, and it looked exactly what we're supposed to be getting from the Emergency Active Travel Fund. But at the other end of Oldfield Road, you've got no wands and you've got loads of parking in the cycle lane. So, you know, we've got to look at the whole picture. I've made that mistake before of just picking out a nice picture, and it's not good elsewhere on the route. Okay, so in London, I'm going to be spending a lot of time on London because there's lots of things happening. Better Streets for Havering see it's great to see 4 school streets, but the council seems to have given up on the other 14 which were to be trialled. So, you know, Havering surprised me. And that's the only thing they had anyway, was the school streets. Now in Hackney, oh, take a look at those planters. They are apparently in Corton steel, which looks like this after about a week, a sort of rustic look. So I don't know if you think that looks nice. I think it looks quite nice. That's the kind of materials that should be more difficult to push out of the way. And Middleton Road will be closed from 9th of September. Yoo-hoo. I picked up this factoid. From 2001 to 2011, filtered permeability schemes in Hackney were associated with halving the number of car trips and doubling cycle trips. I don't know where that factoid comes from. Hackney has really been the capital of filtered permeability in London and probably elsewhere. Okay, in London again, 50 miles of main road, 24-hour bus lanes, experimental traffic order from TfL, effective 13th of September for up to 18 months. There's your link. It's already been like that on the A4020 in Ealing Broadway, main road going out west. There's the sign. And Silvertown Tunnel is being questioned by the Shadow Minister for Climate Change. Ooh, be nice to see that scrapped. Here's a nice school street in Islington. Also, there are new cycle lanes to go in Holloway Road to Pentonville Road. This is, oops, that's Hanover School in Islington. Nice school street. Tower Hamlets, Tower Hamlets, that's Brick Lane has been filtered. Okay, now something about Ealing. I did show these slides last week. This is, as was mentioned, this is yellow sawdust to mop up the motor oil, which is there presumably to make cyclists skid. Pro-low traffic neighbourhood residents have a WhatsApp group and they organised to reinstate after vandalism. Vandalism poured cement into the bollard holes and residents chisel it out. Arrests have been made with regard to either this or some other vandalism. I think it is important, I had a long chat with the acting editor of Local Transport today, to not overemphasize all vandalism. There is vandalism, there is opposition, and there are various fruitcake groups involved, as we mentioned last week, but a lot of people are supporting what's going on. So instead of saying, oh, it's all being knocked back, we do need to look at the positive side as well. There was an article in the Daily Telegraph quoting Grant Shapps, saying that a lot of mistakes had been made with what had been done by local authorities. It depends how you read it. It can be that he's pulling back, that it was all a big joke, but on the other hand, it could just be that they're cracking on as they were anyway, insofar as they were moving forward. Now, this is a nice little graphic from Ealing on how to use a low traffic neighborhood. What they've got is easy to see instructions for drivers saying you can't cross from one side to the other, but you can use, if you want to go into this area, you use Boston Road. If you want to go into this area, you use Northfield Avenue. If you want to go into this area, you use Uxbridge Road. So it's a kind of guide for drivers, which should be helpful. Yes, a protest about rolled parks, Crown Estate Paving Commission. For those of you in London, protest at the crack of dawn, 10 AM at the gates in Park Square East. Don't turn up in Lycra if you're coming by bike. It's a pedestrian protest. It's not for the people who want to do
Bob, don't turn up at all. It's cancelled.
So it's cancelled. All right.
It's cancelled. Police are cracking down on protest at the moment. It's cancelled. Sorry, folks.
Okay. Oh dear. I shall inform the relevant potential protesters. Oh dear. Hammersmith Bridge, the latest is councils asking for £27 million to make it safe for pedestrians and cyclists only. That'd be good. Richmond Park, oh dear. They're considering a small parking charge for the 12% of visitors who stay in the car parks, but nothing for the 88% passing through, certainly in the rush hour. At £1.40. Well, that's not going to restrict motor vehicle usage in the park. Oh yeah, and you might have seen this from the girls' private school, Greycoat Hospital School, issued a thing saying younger students not permitted to cycle to school for health and safety reasons, bicycle storage for use by sixth form students only. Lambeth, yeah, this is Walnut Tree Walk Primary School in Fitzallen Street. And that looks nice. There's your nice picture from last week. Whereas in Forest Gate, Newham, you've got this. So a few school streets, but most aren't school streets. Kingston, plans announced for LTNs. Started 17th of August for Albert Road and Lower Ham Road low traffic neighbourhoods. And they're due to be in place from yesterday. Will be trialled for 6 months. So there's your links on what's happening in Kingston. It does take time, but something's going in now. Camden, there's a nice graphic on what they've done. 8 locations widened pavement, 13 residential roads quieter, 5 new streeteries, 4 new pop-up cycle lanes, etc., etc. Enfield, phase 1 of the Bowes low traffic neighbourhood was due to finish on Friday. And Westminster has got 20-mile-an-hour limits throughout. Lewisham, I've shown this before. Roger has been videoing this bit of filtering for 7 weeks. And he says there's a slight drop off in numbers of drivers ignoring signage and a few turning around after seeing the signage. Just cycle lanes there, road closure, camera usage. Maybe some drivers are just accepting the fine as something they have to accept, or that they won't pay it, or think it'll go away, or whatever. There's still an issue about the enforcement of low traffic neighbourhoods. Nice little piece from Ross Lydell of the Evening Standard, responding to a complainer about LTNs and cycle lanes. He says, as for cycle lanes, they're not empty. They're occasionally clear because they are so efficient at allowing people to travel quickly through town. The future has 2 wheels, not 4. And that's quite important from the city hall editor of Evening Standard. Your reading, as usual. This new post from Cycling UK about decarbonisation is important. There's the new one on e-bike users. Everything else there is still relevant and still worth reading if you haven't read it. There's the Phil Goodwin stuff on climate change, and living streets on open street maps, worthwhile looking at to see what's happening. Consultations still on roads policing. The highway code review, very important. I was on a DFT seminar with Dave Davis and Brenda, who's here today, earlier on, and we do hope the central idea of the hierarchy of danger is going to go through. Don't forget to respond to the consultation document. You've got till October 27th. Some things like helmets are not included, but you can add on comments about what you think should be said about them in the additional comments. Spending review, coroners, planning for the future, and the pavement parking as well. Okay, I noticed this from Twitter, something under Birmingham City Council. Oh dear, you know, having to give way at every single driveway. Now, I was just going to say, does LTN 120 apply retrospectively? It should do. And here's some car ads. There's a lot of subvertising going on. I like that one. And also that one. Electric vehicles don't solve the problem. So that's basically it for this week.
My name's Vicky Lebrec, despite what my name tag says, I'm not Sarah Dowling. So I work for Road Peace, which is a national charity for road crash victims. And we support people that have been in crashes and also campaign for road danger reduction. We've today launched a campaign in conjunction with CLOCS, which stands for Construction Logistics and Community Safety. I'll tell you a bit about CLOCS very quickly, and for the people that don't know what it is. It essentially came about because the construction industry used to have a lot of issues with death and injury on site. They've now got a lot of issues in terms of death and injury on the roads. I'm myself a victim of that. I was run over by a skip lorry while cycling to work and lost my leg as a result of the crash. So I now manage the policy campaigns and media for Road Peace. And we've launched this campaign, and the campaign ultimately is to get local authorities to sign up to CLOCS. CLOCS isn't just about vehicle design, it's also about, you know, planning routes properly, driver training, things like that. And the reason we've launched it is obviously there's a push for active travel, which is fantastic, but equally there's a forecast really large increase in terms of government spend, I think off the back of the fact that we, you know, how the economy is with COVID. Currently, I think, you know, local government construction makes up about 11% of the total construction in the UK. So it's pretty significant, and the number of vehicles that you see on the road, you know, HGVs and such, which are a big threat to vulnerable road users, is due to construction. The big stat is that over the last 5 years, they've done some analysis with Agilicis, and there were 28,325 people killed or injured by construction vehicles in the UK over the last 5 years. And the campaign really is about getting local authorities to sign up to CLOCS and become a CLOCS champion, so that when they do construction projects, building schools and things like that, which is forecast to increase, the procurement which they will put in place then means that the vehicles that will be, you know, bringing construction elements to the project will be CLOCS compliant. So we sent a letter out to all local authorities today. I haven't got any slides, I'm doing this off my phone, but I would encourage all of you to go to CLOCS, which is clocs.org.uk/CLOCSworks. And we've got a campaign there, so that includes a film featuring some victims from Road Peace who've lost someone at the hands of a construction vehicle, and also a template letter to then send to local authorities. So thank you, and would very much appreciate your help with all of that. Thanks.
I was going to give you a whistle-stop tour through what Audit is, isn't, what it does well, what it does badly. I am a road safety auditor. The good, bad and ignorant is deliberate. I do think some auditors are ignorant, but not all of them. Quite often what is perceived as ignorance on the part of an auditor is actually a result of poor information on the part of a designer. So it's kind of very much it's a joint relationship, everyone's in it together. Give auditors good information, you'll probably get a better result. A few images here are the sorts of things that we look at. My team deal with everything from vehicle restraints, urban design, cycle schemes, including innovations, Billy and Belinda bollards, I'll come back to later, sound like a frivolous issue but isn't, and visually impaired users. I work for a company called Jacobs. I am not officially representing Jacobs, but I wouldn't say anything here I wouldn't happily say in front of our board. One version of the truth on that. So who am I? Discipline lead for operational road safety. Operational road safety is the road safety of the active network. So it's not construction safety, although we do support that as well. I'm a road safety auditor. I'm a fellow of the Society for Road Safety Auditors. I'm on the CRHD Health Safety and Wellbeing Panel, what used to be the Road Safety Panel, but now broader remit. Member of the Road Safety Observatory, although that's been a little bit of sort of an abeyance at the moment. And PACT's Road Environment Working Group, Transport Safety Commission. And psychology graduate is quite important, because I think we need to understand how people behave and are motivated and how we can change that behaviour. I don't think if we understand that behaviour, we can do anything about it. I like that little graphic. What do you want? Evidence-based peer review. So I'm just going to quickly run through what road safety audit is and where it came from. Is it a legal requirement? Because people get tied up in that, and it's yes and no, obviously. how it works, what the output is. You can't pass and fail it. I think you kind of think it's a little fail at road safety audit, doesn't work like that. What it doesn't do well, or at all, and what kind of issues come up in urban cycling schemes. So just a reminder, totally stand by this, there's no such thing as a safe highway. I always cringe a bit when people talk about safe routes to school, implying it's a zero risk option. There is no zero risk option. And even the most optimistic view about things like connected autonomous vehicles, people will still fall in front of cars as they pass, how slow they're going. I think the first fatality was hit at 4 miles an hour. There's no such thing as safe, but you can be a lot more safe, and that's where we come from. No opportunity to reach for anyone who hasn't seen it. I think the most powerful graphic I've ever seen. If you Google Guardian all causes of death 2010, you'll find it. The grey blob in the middle is all causes of death in that year, 193,000, roughly 500,000. When people fixate about cycling, they tend to forget that actually it's very small. This red sort of hand, top right, is all accidental and external factors, which includes everything from suicide, hanging, strangulation, poisoning, etc. The traffic accidents is little sub-hand down here, and off that cyclist, teeny little dot. And I think this is a really great image. It doesn't matter that it's out of date because those numbers haven't changed in real terms. This is really powerful when people bleat about how dangerous cycling is, to give them perspective, because cycling is the golden bullet for reducing a lot of these things, mortality and morbidity. So although road safety audit isn't around these things, I encourage auditors to understand these things, because it should be about the bigger picture. So it might be your audit report doesn't talk explicitly about mortality and morbidity because the scope doesn't allow us to. No reason we can't put it in a covering letter or in a wider conversation or in discussions with designers and clients. So what is road safety audit?
Sorry to interrupt. Sorry, you're on such a flow, and I love this picture as well. You just given us a real big crackle. I didn't know whether you were doing a Chris thing and had a weird mic on, or is it just?
No.
Actually, no, you're perfect. But okay, we'll see how it goes. Yeah.
I'll press the button carefully. So right. This is a real photo. It's not photoshopped. But the cynic might say this is what you end up with road safety audit. You know, and excessively safe, and it's clearly ridiculous. I don't think it is what you end up with, road safety audit. It's very much good brief and good guidance to the road safety audit on what the design proposal is will give you a good result. And we'll come to some examples. So what is it? It is a check by independent specialists with experience of investigation and prevention. You can't do it unless you've had this training. It identifies hazards that can result in injuries, and we define that as something that would be categorised as a Stats 19 injury. Some things have Stats 19 as a standard reporting system goes to police. Some things don't turn up in Stats 19, so pedestrians who trip over things. If there's no vehicle involved, cycle includes a vehicle.
Hey,
yes?
sorry, it's Steve. Just as your vocals sort of crackling up quite badly. I just wondered, to reduce bandwidth, would you turn off your video, but see if your audio improves as a result?
Give that a go.
There's a little stop video button.
Video, let's try that. See if that's any better.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, let's give that a go.
Good again. So it identifies hazards that will cause injuries. It considers all user groups, including visually impaired pedestrians, mobility impaired pedestrians, that's wheelchair users, walking frame users, walking sticks, mobility carriages, and increasingly with considering neurologically impaired pedestrians. That includes people who might have Alzheimer's, dementia forms, or autism. We're starting to understand more about how these people can actually be unintentionally disadvantaged in the environment. We consider all weather, wet and dry and snow and all the rest of it, or traffic conditions or lighting conditions. That lighting includes low sun as well as nighttime and daytime. And the audit makes a recommendation to reduce likelihood of collisions and the severity of those injuries could they occur. So you might not be able to prevent the thing occurring. So if somebody goes to sleep at the wheel, clearly you can't prevent that in a design. Whereas other types of collisions, driver confusion about an environment, you could reduce the likelihood. but you're also reducing the severity. So that's about forgiving roadside, about things like speed management would reduce severity of injury. And this is naturally part of quality audit, which was conceived in Manual for Streets, but that never really took off. But it's also relevant on a standalone of all types of schemes. Different authorities do it to different extents. Where did it come from? Lots of people claim to be the originator of road safety audit. Hertfordshire County Councils certainly have an interesting take that over 30 years ago, they were looking at their highest risk sites. And I think in their top 50 highest injury frequency sites, they'd all been built in the last 10 years and they all complied with standards. That's quite sobering. You know, it's not, you know, old poor quality roads that cause problems. Sometimes it's poor tie-ins of existing roads or alterations that are out of consistency with the rest of the route. It's not just the scheme in isolation, it's where it fits in the context. I think that's very pertinent. Okay, so it occurs over a timeline. If you take the life cycle of a highways project, we go from sort of conceptual design through to operation, and road safety audit officially takes place at, as a minimum, stage 1 at the end of preliminary design and stage 2 at the end of detailed design. Quite often, these get combined for a small scheme. The difficulty with that is sometimes that evaluation takes place so late that decisions have been taken that are hard to undo. And the new GG 119, the National Road Safety Audit Standard, has moved away from the use of combined stages, and is encouraging separate audit. The later you identify issues, the more expensive they are to rectify. So there's a good argument for doing an evaluation at the earliest stage. You can also do feasibility stage. We tend to call stage 0, where you're looking at the concept of something. That's where you get the biggest bang for your buck. The earliest you think about it, the best value you get. And you can do interim audits in between the main stages, either as things evolve, or you can audit multiple options, for example. And then once the scheme's been built, you do a stage 3. In theory, that's post-construction before opening to traffic. In reality, that stage never really happens because we often do things in phases, but that's the theory of the exact time it's done. And then stage 4 audits are post-opening, once 12 and 36 months of casualty data are available. People often think it's done a year and 3 years after opening. It's not. In practice, it's 18 months or even 2 years after opening is the first one when the data are available. And if you get this right, you identify problems early, you reduce design costs, you reduce the liability of the designer and the highway authority, and you get happier clients. Sadly, a lot of people sort of think, well, it's a cost we want to avoid, but it can be a shortcut. What types of schemes should be audited? Arguably everything benefits. Anything that's an improvement in law, that means a permanent alteration, from bypasses of villages, and towns, cycle and pedestrian schemes, traffic calming, pretty much anything that involves alteration, including changing the use of highways, but without physical alterations. So you might make a street one way with almost no alterations, just putting signs up, but evaluating the scope for people to get confused and not understand it clearly. I've known a scheme where installing 20 metres of footway might seem to be something that had no value from auditing it. But what that did in a rural area, it invited people to cross the road at a place that was unsafe. It was just out of good visibility. So actually it seemed like a trivial scheme, but actually potentially had a big impact on user safety. And temporary works, the image bottom right is next to my flat in London, where somebody had the genius idea of putting the sign saying, the sort of customer-friendly TfL sign, how are we doing great things for you, has been put up concealing 2 of the 2 aspects of the traffic signals. And it took 4 or 5 requests for me to get that moved. It's a good example of how temporary works can actually have a serious impact on safety, albeit short term. And a note that Rob was talking about removed markings earlier. Removed markings never really go away. At night and in rainfall, they can be just as conspicuous as the permanent markings. So you can end up with tram lines on the carriageway. So evaluating temporary works is useful, and we do that in motorways now. So the idea of it is squaring the circle. It's getting collision investigation knowledge, road safety engineers who are looking at networks and understanding what works, to feed that back to designers and network managers as a sort of holistic squaring the circle, gaining information and sharing it with people who can use it to improve network safety. Sadly, that happens too little. It tends to still be in isolation on a scheme. Is it a legal requirement? Not explicitly, but the Road Traffic Act, section 39, requires highway authorities to investigate collisions, do things to reduce those collisions, and use the knowledge gained to prevent future similar collisions in new roads, and case law says that means improvements, smaller improvements as well. So essentially, it's not a legal requirement. If you don't do it, you can't prove you're complying with the Road Traffic Act. And it does give you a measure of protection if you do it. So reminder that we have a kind of triangle of things we're always weighing up. Road safety auditors are specifically looking at safety, and they have an understanding of the lawfulness and the compliance relative to standards and so on. But you can have quite a complex issue. You might have something that might be lawful, not comply with the standards, but be safer than something else that does comply with the standards in a certain situation. Very important to have that bigger view about is it better to have a departure from standards that's safe than comply with standards and be unsafe? People often think departures means something is less safe, and it's not true. So how does it work? What's the output? I love this image. I think it might be one of John Dale's images. John's on the call. This is a great example of an urban realm scheme that then got retrofitted with a horrible little flick-flack bollard, because it wasn't actually obvious to people, I think particularly at night, the narrowing. It is one of those, if it doesn't serve people well and they can't see clearly, and we should consider that older drivers have more difficulty reading road scenes at night, it's a failure. It might work on a bright sunny day, but if it doesn't work on a dark, wet day at night, then it's not successful. So what's the output of a road safety audit? Well, the process and the output are defined by the standards. So on the left, we have the national standard that's mandatory for motorways and trunk roads, and lots of local highway authorities use this. Bottom right, CIHT, Chartered Institution of Highways and Transportation, have their own guidelines, originally produced maybe 15 years ago and then updated more recently. And top right, we have the TfL standard. See Andy's on the call, hello Andy. And each of those set out the requirements, but broadly, certainly for the national standard of TfL, you have to have 4 years collision investigation experience to be a team leader in an audit, and 2 years experience to be a team member. In all cases, you have to have done 10 days of formal collision investigation and casualty reduction training. And everyone has to do 2 days CPD, continuing professional development, in road safety audit and collision investigation every year. And they must undertake at least 5 audits in the last year to be an audit team leader, or in the last 2 years to be an audit team member. And the team should be approved by the project sponsor or equivalent person for each audit. So you might have done 100 audits, but if they were all of mini roundabouts and you're now looking at a motorway, then it might be you're not the right person for the job. So there is a specificness about it. And these standards set out the reporting process, but they broadly all follow the same approach. You report problems, each of which is a hazard likely to cause injury. So for example, that might say misleading lane alignments, bottom right. I'm sure some people know what it is. Misleading lane alignments may cause southbound drivers to travel the wrong way in the northbound lane. So you have 2 lanes southbound approaching a pseudo roundabout, 1 lane northbound and 1 lane southbound beyond. So the offside southbound lane is pointing at the oncoming lane, and road users would not be aware of that. And you can see again, just in the middle, there's a little bollard that's been retrofitted. It wasn't part of the original design. It results from that problem. Or we might have tactile paving, which is supposed to line up one side to the other, Bit of a moot point whether visually impaired pedestrians can actually line themselves up and cross, but this is what the standards say. So you might say incorrectly aligned tactile paving may cause people to trip because they, instead of finding the drop curb opposite, they find a raised curb, or worse, are led into the carriageway opposite. And for each problem, you describe the collision type, for example, a head-on collision, or a scenario such as a pedestrian falling into the path of a car and then being hit by that car. And for each problem, you identify recommendations which will remove, reduce, and mitigate that problem. So, for example, for the bottom right, the recommendation might be narrow the southbound carriageway to one lane at the roundabout, or realign tactile paving. And the recommendations must be proportionate. Now, what's difficult as an auditor, if you can see the scheme is catastrophically terrible in your view, and you feel it should be abandoned completely, to say don't do this is not a proportionate recommendation. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to say that. You could say in the covering letter that you feel there are different ways of addressing the scheme, and you would be very happy to assist the client and or design. If you do that, you're now involved in the design and you have to be independent. You can't do the next phase of the audit if you get involved in design. What does it not do? It doesn't challenge bad design unless it's unsafe. So the example bottom right is blatantly ridiculous, but it's not unsafe. It's not actually going to cause an injury. I believe this was intended for future development that was going to come in, but isn't there at the time. And recommendations have to be proportionate, which can confine the auditor. It can't compare options. You can't say we like option A more than option B. You can audit option A and audit option B, but you can't compare them. You can weigh the adjectives maybe. If one audit says we have grave concerns about a high frequency of a high likelihood of a large number of high severity injuries, collisions, that probably gives you an indication it's a bit less good than something that says we have some minor recommendations. But you can't actually pass or fail an audit, and you can't compare options explicitly. It doesn't recognise other benefits, mortality, morbidity, wellbeing effects, for example, active travel. It doesn't recognise the economic benefits of regeneration. It's just about safety, and unashamedly. It also doesn't address road worker safety impacts. So if you make something no worse for road users, but much worse for road workers, that would be a bad outcome, but audit would not find it. Highways England have a process called GG104, Safety Risk Assessment, which does cover that, and local authorities can use that. Safety assessments can be used as an alternative, so you can do comparative evaluation. Road safety audit is an official formulaic thing. You can do road safety assessment that's a bit less formulaic, and that's an alternative approach, and that might weigh up different options, and risk assessment can be part of that. I'll come up to a minute. What issues do urban raise? So the first one, I think probably the biggest, is innovation is, in my view, rightly treated with caution until we have some clarity about what the objective is. Very often the designer gives no explanation of the design methodology or how it's intended to work. They'll have an innovation that seems badly thought through. There's no example of how it's ever been done or anything similar been done, or sort of first principles evaluation of how it might work, and you have to be cautious. The bollards, to write an example, these are bollards painted in the school uniform livery of the adjacent school. In this case, conceal a real child who might be on the tactile paving, and might get drivers used to the idea of seeing a child means you can ignore it because it's a bollard. It's sort of slightly spurious example, but it's an example of how you can do something that seems to be harmless and it could have adverse effects. Auditors' job is to be careful. Deliberate ambiguity we create in a lot of urban design schemes. A lot of schemes that Brian showed last week, you know, good example of those where there's deliberate ambiguity, take away excessive caution, but it can cause problems if visually or mobility or neurologically impaired people are confused. They might have anxiety, they might step into somebody's path because they don't realise they're coming, or they may not visit an area and have social isolation. The evidence base is poor. The evidence base for isolation being harmful is very strong. The evidence base for whether people do stop visiting is poor. I think we need to know more about it. It is an issue. Not all auditors know about everything. Some auditors have more experience in urban design than motorway, or vice versa. In the same way, if you want an architect to design your loft conversion, you probably wouldn't choose one who does, you know, commercial sports centres. You need to pick the right person to do it, and they need to have the right experience. And there are people who don't keep up to date, who don't sort of keep abreast of developments of evidence from outcome of schemes, and therefore maybe are not well practiced in what they do. So, sort of examples of urban schemes, the bottom left and top right, top left are an example of an urban design scheme where after implementation, after it was opened, there were lots of complaints from visually impaired users who said all the street furniture is chrome and brushed steel, and it's therefore camouflaged. It has low tonal contrast, it gets a glare off it in the sun, and they can't see it. And interestingly, almost every piece of street furniture in this has subsequently been hit by vehicles, so maybe it's not visible to vehicles either. So this is a sort of partially pedestrianised street. It's largely pedestrianised in the main centre part of the day, but loading at each end of the day. Bottom right is an example of what happens when you have the road and the islands and the footway all in largely similar tones. People with low colour vision, partial sight could really struggle to see this, combined with the fact we've got a tactile paving arrangement with a huge, the tactile guidances don't put tactile on a curve, and this shows why, because you can't tell whether it's exposed across in that direction into the view or right to left. If you're partially sighted, it may not be obvious unless you're doing a soft shoe dance around on the tactile to try and find the stem. It's very aesthetically very beautiful, but it does have problems. And interestingly, at the top, you'll see that it has a no motor vehicles except buses and taxis at particular times, and cyclist dismount sign, which, and this is quite a newly built scheme, bit of a surprise to me. So I've invited them to remove the cyclist dismount sign because they have no meaning. This is an interesting example of where people think things will get worse. I was on the TSRGD steering group when, so as the traffic signs regulations, general directions, being able to road signs, when this scheme was being considered, and the DFT understandably had concern that it might be problematic. In fact, the 3 years before is the right-hand image, a very standard modern highway. The bottom left is what it was changed to, and it had no injuries in the 3 years after it was changed, because it takes away overconfidence. Local people sadly campaigned to have it returned back to what it was, and it's now a bit of a hybrid with controlled crossings on. But it's an example of how auditors might have said this scheme is ambiguous, but it was good ambiguous. What it's now been changed to is probably less good ambiguous because there have been injuries since it was changed. What alternative approaches can you use? Quality audit, I mentioned, it never really took off, sadly, and that was supposed to integrate safety in place and so on. You can safety assessment that I mentioned, you can do risk assessment to interrogate the real risk, not gut reaction. Our gut reactions are poor. They're a good start point, but then they don't give us everything. A light touch version of the 5 England's process. Looking at horse riding assessments used for more major schemes. Bottom right is quite an interesting one. This is one of the bills, I think they're called, little water channels in more London, and it's got more textured paving each side of the water channel and smoother paving further away. But every time I went down there, you'd see footprints. Now, whether people had fallen into it, or children had walked in it, or dogs had walked into it, I was never really sure. Sadly, they've been filled in, which might say it was unsafe, but it might say people thought it was unsafe. Road safety audit can be conservative as said about ambiguity. Best of ambiguity, it can make everyone careful. Worst of ambiguity, and left as example, Luton Airport fined by health and safety executive for a zebra that wasn't a zebra, had stripes and no other features, and the view was beacons and zigzags, and an ambiguity about who had priority and an alternate was killed. So it's good to be cautious. It doesn't mean you don't go ahead with change, it means you evaluate it carefully. So we're liking a balanced view. I think these two images on the left are a good example. My two professional magazines, Introduced to civil engineers, characterised by the blue tarpaulin of death and how dangerous cycling is. CIHT a little bit more enlightened with it's just a mode of transport. People don't seem to need helmets and high vis on the continent, and it works fine. And the danger is if you avoid all risk, you end up with the thing right. Swings, no swings, and barriers and rubberised matting, but nobody can have any fun. There's a danger if you're not careful, you eliminate all risk and all fun and all benefit. New technology is very important. So from 2022, legislation comes into force, which then becomes applicable on 2024 on all new cars, and some before, so it should be a closed bracket, not zero. A whole package of new technology, including emergency braking, alcohol interlocks, drowsiness detection. The three biggies for me: lane keep assistance, intelligent speed assistance, which effectively is controlling the car at the speed limit, and autonomous braking. And these will have some complex effects on schemes, broadly to make everything work better, because more cars will comply more of the time, and over time more vehicles will have this technology, and some of the biggest causes of collisions get eliminated. So detection of pedestrians and cyclists will be really powerful. So it's very important to keep up to date. But the technology can fail. We had an incident on a road like this where a car with lane assist technology looking for a centre line found the offside cycle lane and pulled the car into oncoming traffic. So that's a standard production vehicle in use at the moment. So the algorithms aren't brilliant, they are fallible. CIHT leading street design, and some of you may be aware the manual for streets is about to be updated. Auditors are sometimes a bit conservative in alternative approaches. They kind of know it works, but I do find in some cases people don't like manual for streets approaches. I think that's about people being educated and properly briefed. So we talked about risk assessment. Net risk is very powerful. You might find a given arrangement has more slight injuries than fewer injuries, serious injuries. Is that better? Is that worse? Hard to say. And we should consider before as well as after. It's easy to picture about Exhibition Road, but it wasn't great before. So risk assessment, you can weigh up different options. Here's an example. You could lose control of this roundabout and crash into the big arc in the middle of the roundabout. And that might cause a very infrequent serious injury, or you might lose control on a more sort of regular basis and hit Central Island signs. That might happen more frequently, but it will typically result in less injury. You can use that to weigh up and capture net outcomes. Very important to consider tonal contrast. Too often, if we've got colour vision, we think we've got it. The top image, the tactile, is detectable. Bottom image, almost invisible. Lots of people don't have good colour vision, and design should provide for them. Auditors should think about that, but they often don't know these issues maybe as well as they should. And my view is individual things should be weighed up. Some things are, poor design, top left, bad design. Is it dangerous? Is it actually going to cause an injury? Probably not in most cases. Somebody might walk into the bollard, poor tonal contrast from some directions. The dark patches, top middle, I'm told that people with neurological impairment perceive dark areas like that as holes. So it can be quite stressful because people are trying to establish, is it a hole to be stepped over or walked around? We need to understand those issues more. The classic lamp column and cycle lane. Is it going to cause an injury on a very lightly traffic path? No, it's not. You can cycle around it. Bottom middle should have no entries on both sides. There's a little cycle entry into the side road and a one-way exit. Is it going to cause an injury? No, it's not. Bottom left is rubbish. The path swaps sides without warning. Is it going to cause an injury? No, it's not. Some auditors will describe those things as injury risks, but can be over-egged if we're not careful. And that's me. If you have been, thanks for listening. That is what I understand happened when they changed the direction of driving in Switzerland, Sweden.
Excellent. Thanks for that, Kate. We've got a few questions. Now's your opportunity to ask road safety auditor your questions. Victoria, did you have a question? I've just been looking at the thing.
Hi. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. I just want to understand, like when a preventing future death report is issued by a coroner, like how does your role play into that?
So auditors can get involved. So if an injury occurs at a location that's been subject to engineering work, then the auditor may be asked for their view on those works. If it's an existing road that hasn't been changed, that probably won't happen. Or they might be asked for a road safety opinion about how good, bad or indifferent the road is. So auditors can be called to give evidence in court. I've done it myself. You're providing information around process as much as design. So was a proper evaluation undertaken? And that's one of the things that the coroner then considers in preparing their report.
I think that's super interesting because the inquest that I've been to is, included like a traffic management officer in terms of like representing what the local authority needs to do, perhaps in terms of changing the road. I'm thinking of this a lot because there was the coroner inquiry recently that the Justice Committee was looking at, and I think a big part of that is preventing future death reports. Very hard to kind of like put together all of the things that are recommended in those, but yeah, okay, yeah, thank you for that answer. I think yeah, I wish that coroners would consider that a bit more.
I agree, and it's quite patchy. The actual evaluation and findings are quite variable in my experience. Some coroners have a different approach to others, and so it should be impartial. It should be the same wherever you are, but it's not.
It's
like
not, and I will share with the group. We had 2 of our members who lost. Well, their daughter was killed in a crash, and they did a good kind of like bit of research into what coroners were doing in terms of preventing future death reports. And it is extremely patchy. It's literally just down to like the coroner's preference, more or less, as to whether or not they think it's important.
It's not well regulated.
No, it's not. Okay, thank you for answering my question.
Dane, did you have a question? I'm just gonna. Yeah. Oh, go on then, Dave.
Well, I'm coming in on the phone because it's a better microphone. I've switched the speaker off, but I've got a screen to type on. I'd like to pick up on Victoria's stuff as well, because a couple of inquests I've been absolutely fuming. And I did something with Andrea about a woman who ended up under a bus seriously injured, and 8 weeks later, another woman walking the same journey from the same primary school to the same shops ended up under a bus dead. And, how do we get that process of picking up serious crashes, investigating them properly, putting it into the audit process and saying, this is a danger, and getting action? There's so much like that. And I was flagging section 39, which is basically marking your own homework. That really needs a revision. Section 39 is where the road authority is told to investigate crashes, not to publish the reports, not to employ qualified investigators or anything like that, and then tell themselves what to do to improve road safety. It's a closed loop. Nobody gets to see it. And I suspect from what Andrea and myself have done, it's a very flawed process. So what's the thoughts on that?
Did you respond to the coroner inquiry at close? You can probably still email in, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I've got a few, and I think we're going to have a little conversation about that sometime.
I think.
And the other would be, you mentioned Susie Ball, or we've mentioned Susie Ball, who 3 years it has taken to get the company that employed the driver that let him put his stuff in the bad place. It took me 2 years with Cycling UK to get Fry's in court because their driver killed the 2 cyclists on the A30. We're not getting anywhere with getting the road companies out the way. It's not just the drivers and the road safety of companies who are driven by the imperative of profit rather than the due diligence, duty of care for safety.
Yeah, I think that the campaign that I mentioned, CLOCS, is kind of all around that, because I think it's 100% like it's all driven by profit, and then you get basically like cowboys driving HGVs, and the companies are cowboys. So maybe we could pick up on that separately if you'd like to.
Yeah, and to Kate, coming back to Kate, the thing we got with Charlie Lloyd and myself talking to the Met Police investigators, 80% of the fatals with cyclists and HGVs, the driver hits the cyclist from the rear. There's nothing about going up the near side. It's always hit from the rear, usually the near side in the blind spot.
It's a lot of misrepresentation.
And because the construction HGV is at least 40 centimetres below the cab to go under, the victims are usually the ones that go under and get knocked down. With a more conventional HGV, the gap is down to about 20 centimetres. And I'll challenge most of you to get under a 20 centimetre gap very easily. The 40 centimetres means you just get knocked flat and go straight under the wheels. The other factor in HGVs, which I'm very pleased to see, we've now got at least 2 sites in London where left turns have been banned. And one site, there were 2 fatalities within 5 years by large vehicles turning left from the right-hand lane. And the reason is that the corner is less than 5.5 metres radius, and the swing is such that the HGV hits things. And there's the famous BBC video of the Ducati being hit. Most people have seen that. Peckham Road, builder's 26-ton 3-axle truck, turning left, pedestrian on the corner with a pram on his near side rear wheel, so he makes sure he misses the near side corner with the rear wheel, but that means he has to drive into the oncoming traffic, forcing priority. The motorcyclist sees this, but stops short. But he doesn't stop short enough, and the truck carries on and rams the motorbike. Because the road layout, the road geometry has not been audited, and it should be no left turns for large vehicles, or whatever.
All right,
I mean,
Dave,
yeah, I was going to say audit wouldn't necessarily identify that. You know, if it's legal to have a left turn, an auditor wouldn't necessarily say you can't do that. Removing the left turn definitely reduces conflict and therefore reduces risk. But then obviously the movement has to take place somewhere else. But it's a good example of where audit might correctly evaluate the design that's present. It doesn't eliminate all hazards. Sometimes the design makes things better, but not good enough. Sometimes it makes things worse. You know, we see a lot of things that are actually making things worse. And it is difficult. And some of those things are traffic operation rather than road infrastructure.
Excellent. I've got a list of people that want to ask you questions, Kate, which shows how much you piqued the interest. I've got to bring David Davis in first because I think he's had his hand up for the longest time.
Yes, it's getting very tired. Thank you very much, Kate. That was really good. So I was the lead author on the IHT 1990s cycle audit and cycle review guidelines. And although I think it was a useful publication, I mean, cycle audit was about auditing schemes and make sure they were safe and also beneficial, taking advantage where possible of guidance to improve things for cyclists. And the review was about really assessing a level of service for existing roads and schemes. But although I'm a champion of it, I think, to be honest, we didn't make it mainstream. It always ended up being put on the desk of the poor cycling officer, and they were told to go away and do this, and we didn't really break into the mainstream engineering market, which I think is so often the trouble with guidance and so forth that is put forward by cycling organisations. It's seen as the job of the cycling officer and not mainstream. Hopefully now that's changing. And
it is. But it is designers who need that. You know, designers need to know that. Designers need to know how to design for motorcyclists, how to design for cyclists, and too often they don't. And network managers need to know, you know, what are the features of existing roads that are hazardous, you know, whether it's chamber location in braking and turning zones or physical layouts, road marking positions and so on. Yeah. There's too little knowledge, and too often it's taken as an aside. It's a specialist job, and I hope that Gear Change will see it. And Gear Change essentially says you shouldn't design unless you cycle. I'd like to say you shouldn't audit unless you cycle, with maybe some exemptions for, you know, people from a disability or whatever. I do think if you don't know how to cycle, there is a question of, you know, how great an auditor you are if you don't have that insight.
I'm very optimistic too, and having people like you involved, you know, you work for the Highways England, and you're also working on this. So I think that's great. So I've got loads of questions, but if I can just limit it to one, what about the issue where a scheme is put forward, the auditor comes along, and I'm thinking particularly of a cycle scheme. Auditor comes along and says, oh, I don't think it's safe, or there are hazards, there are problems, and so forth. And you say, the audit designer says, well, look, it may not be perfect, but it's a damn sight better than the existing alternatives, existing scheme. And how does that, is that safety audit as you're describing? Sorry,
yeah,
the assessment rather.
Yeah, so the auditor gives a response and says, you can't say it's better or worse, although it can be inferred from the nature of the comments you raise. The designer and the overseeing organisation, i.e. the Highway Authority, can say, I hear what you say, but I'm going to completely ignore you and do the opposite. And that's the Highway Authority's decision. The Highway Authority is the grown-up, and therefore they get to decide. And as an auditor, you only throw your toys out the pram if you think they really haven't understood the issue. Whereas if you say, well, they've understood it, they've chosen to do the opposite of what I recommend, that's their prerogative.
But it does put responsibility on them. If they say, we're going to go for this new scheme, which has got a hazard in it, you know, is there not pressure on them to keep things as they are?
It's the Highway Authority's decision at the bottom line. And sometimes they're risk averse, sometimes they're not risk averse enough. Depends on the complexion of the Highway Authority sometimes.
Right, Shane's the one who's been waiting the longest.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Kate. And I'm a long time since I've reviewed the process, but as many of us are campaigners, one of the things I'd like to call out, and stop me if I'm wrong, I think David alluded to this, is there's no level of service consideration in the assessment of a scheme for people walking or cycling. And so, you know, you can make anything safe by putting a yield marking on it or a stop sign on it. And I mean, Bob had a slide at the start where he had cyclists yield at every side road, which might have passed road safety audit, but be completely impractical in terms of cycling. And everybody knows that nobody on a bicycle is going to pay any attention to those yield markings. So all you've done is put the blame on the cyclist for any injuries that result from poor design. And that can be completely compliant with the road safety audit process and the road safety audit documentation. And I think this is a problem for anybody here that wants to improve things for people who cycle. And I just...
It is. Like, that's design control issue, I think, and I'm hoping gear change will see, and LTM 120 will see a change in that, because it's about getting the design right. Auditors should pick up some of these things. Some of the network issues are quite thorny. You know, the auditor might be of the view that people shouldn't be on this route, should be on a different route, you know, assigned to a different route. But that's outside scope. That falls into the unrepresented, disproportionate recommendations. So the process, I do think, is very fallible, and it gives no consideration of comfort or convenience or attractiveness. Only if we can say those features cause injury risk, can we raise them. We can mention them in a covering letter, but essentially the audit process is very narrow. And I think that's a shame, really. I'd like to see it include active travel benefits to be a more holistic evaluation, both of the design and its safety impact.
But I think the takeaway from anybody listening to that is, like, the audience here is that we should not feel constrained to accept the recommendations of a road safety audit simply because it came from a road safety audit. But the road safety audit process is inherently flawed from our perspective, and we shouldn't feel, you know, obliged to accept the road safety auditor's recommendation simply because he's a road safety auditor, or she. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to cause offence, but it's...
No, absolutely. And I think, you know, it might be we end up with an audit process against design requirements, you know, a gear change LPM 120 compliance audit.
Okay, that's good. Tim, I'll bring Tim in now. I know there's a lot of you waiting, but we'll get there.
Hi, thank you very much. It's kind of a question. I've been trying to understand why substandard width design lines have not been picked up in road safety audits. They were put in 2 or 3 years ago. Now, I understand, following the discussion that we've just had here and understanding LTN 120 and gear change, my question is, how do we expect gear change, substandard width designs, etc., to go forward into RSA audit 4s and things like that? And how we can reinforce that need to identify now stuff that's been delivered a year ago should actually have that picked up?
Yeah, it's a grey area because there is that question is, you know, how much is not enough? You know, clearly a 600 mil cycle lane is ridiculous. You know, is a metre enough? Is 1.2 enough? If we're now saying 1.5 is enough, that's helpful because if there's something absolute, it helps auditors to say that's enough. But from an auditor's perspective, there isn't anything to tell you explicitly. There's nowhere to go for an answer of, is this width enough? Now, I think we will have that, you know,
we've always had 1.5 meters in government design for documentation as the recommended width for a very long time. So
different documents had different dimensions, and then there's the grey area. If you can give 1.2, is that better than nothing? And the answer is, it's very unclear. You know, some people would say yes, some people would say no. So it isn't an absolute. It's, if you could give 1.5, absolutely, yes, you should do that. What if giving 1.5 makes drivers more likely to drive in it? So it's that complex action and interaction thing, how you change people's behaviour, and it can be quite complex in, you know, interaction.
The reason specifically asking is how we highlight that the Highways Authority's team's designers and the implementation is designing and delivering unsafe stuff.
Yeah,
and typically
and I think
in the past,
I think you hold them to the design standard, not the audit. The audit it can be useful, but if the designer says the auditor, we've provided 1.2, the Highway Authority has proposed that is outside the scope of your audit and you can't comment on it, they can do that. Then your hands are tied. You know, sometimes you are told there are things you can't comment on.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed.
We still do, to be honest.
Yeah.
All right,
Thank you very much.
Adam, you were next up. I'm just going to try and get everybody in. Leaving holding myself back. It's all good. Adam, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. I think I've got a pretty good idea what the answer is. Question is, can or does the process consider or take account of situations that might encourage risk avoidance behaviour rather than causing accidents? And I think this follows very much on from the previous question. If you've got a narrow cycle lane, you might encourage cyclists to use a different route or to use the pavement. So you're probably not getting an increase in accidents, but you are encouraging people to perceive that accident is more likely and then avoid it. But my feeling is that the answer is pretty short here.
It is difficult, and sometimes you're weighing up conflicting objectives. So if you provide a poor cycle facility which leads behavioural change to mean cyclists will then ride on the footway, you create conflict with pedestrians. The likelihood of injuries to pedestrians is a lot less than the perception of injuries to pedestrians. But if you then create other knock-on problems, it's difficult for the auditor to try to establish what that way up will be. Some of it's about numbers, because as an auditor, you've just got a plan. You've got no information about cycle numbers generally, no information about pedestrian numbers, no information about do cyclists peak at the same time that pedestrians peak? Are they all going the same direction? They're going opposite directions. The stuff you'd like to know, you don't know. So auditors should be considering sort of consequential effect on behaviour. Whether they always do, I don't know. And some of it is down to we don't always know what behaviour change will be. And on a plan, it's not always obvious what that change might be. Okay,
great answer again. I think we've got a Professor Parkin who wants to ask a question.
Yay.
That'll be a tough one if it's coming from
I hope so. Hello, John. Can't hear you, John. Are you on mute?
I think he just dropped out, Kate. He's coming back into the meeting now.
Okay, I won't take it personally.
Well, we'll hear from Mark Strong. I think he had a question as well. Go on, Mark.
Yeah, it was quite relevant to to Dave's, I think, previous question about exception cases. So on the Old Shoreham Road step tracks, so the ones that went in some years ago, basically the designers, which I think included before Brian was involved, specified a step track. And now we know what a step track looks like, but the road safety auditors at the time were very, very wary because it was new and said, this is really, really hazardous. It'll cause all sorts of conflicts. You shouldn't do it. And the designer at the council essentially overruled them, and that got into all sorts of issues about you can't overrule this because you're not a qualified engineer.
And it ended up with her really being in a very stressful place. And in the end, actually, she took stress leave because she was subject to so much criticism for not being the right person to overrule them. And the road safety auditors actually wrote to took the liberty of writing to the council saying this person can't overrule us. When she'd said, yes, I can. And there was sexism in there as well, and there was all sorts of issues. And so you have to be quite a strong person to stand up to that level of, so it's two things. It's about innovation, but it's also about who has the final word. I know legally it should be the designer, but
it is.
What happens when? How can you overrule them in a way which sticks?
So everyone needs to be big enough to stand up for themselves, and orders need to be robust in their recommendations and substantiate them. And highway authorities have the ultimate decision. If an auditor feels that decision is fundamentally unsafe, they can flag it. And I have been in that situation where I felt that what was being done was catastrophic, and you record that. Whereas there are other situations where you may feel something is not properly proven. Very often innovation is provided to auditors with no guidance at all. There's no evidence base for this has been done in other countries. This is how it works. Here's a photo of what it looks like somewhere else. That designers can be their own worst enemy in not helping auditors understand what the proposal is, because the precautionary principle says, if in doubt, you're going to say, haven't seen it before, we should be cautious, in which case my take would be you do it in a careful, methodologically evaluated way and monitor it. There's nowhere near enough monitoring. And if you monitor it, you'll find out that it works. And as you say, you then get that finding. It shouldn't be personal. You should be big enough to have a professional, frank exchange of views without it being personal. But I have seen it get personal. People's parentage challenged.
This was exceptional because it was then going to be opened by the minister, Norman Baker, at the time. So the DFT then got involved, saying the minister has to be certain that anything that's being opened is going to be safe. So there's an extra layer of risk assessment in there.
Yeah. And risk assessment can be useful, actually. I like auditors to, use that as an option. Your gut might say, "Oh, really not sure," and then you work out what type of things might occur with what frequency and what severity. And sometimes when you do that evaluation, you find out it's nowhere near as bad as you thought. Lots of things we thought would be hazardous turned out to be fine, or in fact better.
Thanks,
you need
Kate.
to be open to that change.
Okay, John Parkin, I believe you're in now.
Thank you. Yeah, sorry, my Wi-Fi dipped. Actually, that's a beautiful segue, Kate, into my question, which is quite a short one. You indicated earlier that road safety auditors are trained to identify hazards that cause injury, but is not their role really about overall risk management rather than that detailed, fine-grained what's wrong in detail, but it's the overall thing?
It should be that holistic view, and it's a shame that it doesn't consider road workers. You don't get the opportunity. Sometimes you might want to say this gets 99% better for cyclists and 2% worse for motor vehicle users, and we're not really worried about that. Or it gets better for motor vehicle users and worse for motorcyclists. It's a bit of a blunt instrument in my view, and in many ways it doesn't serve us as well as we'd like. I'd like it to be more comparative in some ways. You can get two audits. You might have two options, and one option your feeling is it's fantastic and you need to make a slight change to make it better, and the other one is catastrophically appalling, and here is the one audit problem that explains why, and they're both an audit report with one problem in. There is no mechanism to show that broad risk management. So at the minute, for me, the process doesn't work as well as it should.
Yeah,
that's good, Kate. Yeah, we're coming towards the end now, but David Davis did ask a really good question in the chat, so I kind of want to finish by asking your opinion on this as well. Really about publishing them all. If we could all see them, then at least. And I've been trying to put a presentation together, and it's hard getting hold of them just to point out.
The reason for not publishing, or an argument for not publishing, is that if you know everything you write is going to be published, and essentially audits are discoverable. The process is supposed to be a no holds barred response to the design, and knowing it's going to be published, it makes auditors potentially wary of being overcritical. You might be criticizing someone in your own organization or a client organization. It's not a no blame game, this. So if you're saying, bluntly, the design is rubbish, then you don't want to be defamatory to other people. And one of the other problems is, because it's a very formulaic process, it's easy for somebody who doesn't work in audit to misunderstand what it is that auditors are saying. Now, that's the auditor's fault if they haven't explained it clearly, but you can write something entirely compliant with the process correctly and make it look like the scheme is going to make things worse, for example, when it's not. It might be making it 80% better, and with these 2 changes, you can make it 90% better. But the audit doesn't allow us to do that, and it can get misread. So that's an argument for keeping it confidential so people can be very open. Otherwise, you might actually end up with almost 2 versions of communication, the stuff that takes place above the visibility line and below. And I don't think that's healthy either.
Yeah, I'm not sure you quite convinced me. I mean, we're all kind of living under that pressure of what the...
I mean, they're all discoverable, yeah. But it's audit is different from design. You know, design is, you know, all public. You work out what you're going to do and you publish this is what you're going to do. The audit is supposed to be asking yourself, is it good? And there should be, that feedback should happen. You know, auditors are like the equivalent of pharmacists to exist to stop doctors killing patients. You know, we're there to stop designers unwittingly injuring people. And if we have to be sort of cagey about what we write for fear of being seen to be critical, and we can be accused of being unprofessional if we're sort of robust in our recommendations. We think something's terrible and we say it's terrible. We've been accused then of being, you know, critical and you know, rude about designers. There's one of those sort of can't win thing. Everything is discoverable and we work on that basis. But in some ways, making it discoverable impedes openness.
Yeah, and just to finish, I mean, we're being critical and picking the holes, but it's internationally renowned as best practice, the UK road safety audit process. And so, yeah, it'd be moot now for me to pick all the holes in it that I was going to pick in. But I think we've been through a lot of them. I don't really need my cheeky perspective. So thanks, Kate. I think we'll round it up there.
If anyone's got any offline questions they want to ask, I'm happy for anyone to drop us a line, kate.carpenter@jacobs.com.